I'm excited to have you guys here. Excited to see these back as part of our college environment. All right, without further ado, our first Brownbag speaker for the spring semester is Dr. Bryan Mclaughlin. Dr. Mclaughlin is an associate professor in the Department of Advertising and Brand Strategy. I was really excited to see him come and share his research with us today. Again, it's on the screen. I don't need to introduce it, but nonetheless I will, because that's why I'm here. His presentation is called Caught in a Dangerous World, Political Narratives and News Addiction. So if you will, join me in welcoming Dr. Mclaughlin.
Thanks, Glenn. Hey, everyone. As Glenn kind of alluded, I'm going to talk about some of the past research I've done, kind of start with that, the political narrative stuff, and then move into some more current research I'm doing with Melissa Gottlieb, who's here, and then Devin Mills, who's in the Community, Family, and Addiction Sciences Department here at Texas Tech. We've been working on this news addiction, which is kind of the new strain of research we're going into. So we'll talk about that. Just really kind of quick background on my research interest. Most broadly, I've been interested in social identity and intergroup conflict. This goes all the way back to undergrad when I was looking at topics like religious violence. Then I started becoming interested in religion and politics, race and politics, and then just naturally, based on the way things were going and my interest in social identity, I became drawn to political polarization. If you study politics, it's pretty much hard to avoid at this point. So kind of looking from the intergroup conflict, social identity approach, things like that. But along the way, I was also doing some work with some grad students looking at kind of narrative transportation and different entertainment media strands that I connected to this politics and started focusing on political narratives. And that really became the focus of me for the last few years until I kind of turned towards this news addiction stuff. So I'm going to start by kind of overviewing some of the research I've done in political narratives, really highlighting the kind of conceptualization that I've done with some co-authors, thinking about how we can study political narratives and what's going on here, and just highlighting a few small details from studies, not really getting too much in the weeds in terms of what I've done methodologically. But I wanted to start by showing an example of a political narrative. So this is an ad from Donald Trump. This was actually right before the 2016 election. And so this would be kind of considered his closing argument in terms of political ads. And we can see plenty of narrative elements, but I think it's a pretty compelling ad if you consider how effective he was and what he was trying to accomplish. Let's go ahead and watch this.
Our movement is about replacing a failed and corrupt political establishment with a new government controlled by you, the American people. The establishment has trillions of dollars at stake in this election. For those who control the levers of power in Washington and for the global special interest, they partner with these people that don't have your good in mind. The political establishment that is trying to stop us is the same group responsible for our disastrous trade deals, massive illegal immigration, and economic and foreign policies that have bled our country dry. The political establishment has brought about the destruction of our factories and our jobs as they flee to Mexico, China, and other countries all around the world. It's a global power structure that is responsible for the economic decisions that have robbed our working class, stripped our country of its wealth, and put that money into the pockets of a handful of large corporations and political entities. The only thing that can stop this corrupt machine is you. The only force strong enough to save our country is us. The only people brave enough to vote out this corrupt establishment is you, the American people. I'm doing this for the people and for the movement, and we will take back this country for you, and we will make America great again.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
All right, so that's a helpful example for how we can think about what political narratives are. Right now, just most broadly, political narratives are stories about social political issues, right? They still have the same characteristics as any narrative. They have characters, they have plot, they have a temporal sequence, and there's some kind of moral evaluation usually. But in this case, we're talking about stories about politics, the political world, and there's some kind of attempt to define social political reality. And now it's pretty striking in this example. He's telling you, here's the problem, right? Here's who's evil, right? The political establishment. Here's what they're doing. Here's what the problems are, and here's how we're going to change it. I'm going to change it. You're going to help me. And so we have a clear dichotomy between good and bad guys, which is very typical with political narratives, really filtered more and more into good and evil, right? Kind of these classic battles that we think about. And these are really instrumental in understanding political issues. In fact, you can't really understand political issues at all without narratives. Without narratives, without the overall context, they're really devoid of meaning. And those narratives, those stories that people tell about the state of America, what's going on, who's involved, what's all at stake, really contextualizes why people have certain issues, positions on issues, and what to think about them. So that's just kind of an overview of political narratives. Now, political narratives are nothing new. People have studied political narratives for years. We've often heard about the importance of controlling the political narrative. What was kind of original in terms of what my colleagues and I did was looking at narrative transportation in the context of politics. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, narrative transportation is often applied to entertainment and fictional genres, although not exclusively. Certainly in health comm, people look at other contexts. But a lot of times it's easy to think about this in terms of a show, right? So I like to use the example of Game of Thrones. Anyone here watch Game of Thrones? Okay, pretty good representation, right? Now, if you think about Game of Thrones, you talk about the plot, it just sounds ridiculous, right? There's, dragons and zombie army and magic and all this stuff. But I found myself completely absorbed in it, right? And you kind of, when you're watching it, it feels real, right? Even though it's so ridiculous, so out of the blue, not at all based in reality. But when you're watching it, it doesn't feel that way. You're so absorbed, cognitively, mentally, you're absorbed, emotionally, you're absorbed. If a character you like dies, you might feel a little sick in your stomach. And that's a physiological response, right? And so we kind of think about that. And I really like this definition, or this way of describing it, just being in the narrative world. Right? Consciously, we're not here. We're not in our immediate surroundings. We're not in the world around us. We're in the narrative, right? And that's kind of how we can think about it. And then we have both, cognitive, emotional, physiological responses, and we're not really paying attention to the world around us. Now, usually, often with entertainment narratives, when it's over, we snap back and we're back in the real world, right? Now, one of the things that I think is important to highlight is this. Comes important to how I think about political narratives, is that we're not actually transporting the stimulus itself, right? The stimulus is there and it prompts a mental reaction, but it's all occurring in our head, right? We have to mentally reflect it, we have to kind of model it, and then activate it, and then interpret it. So we fill in the dots, right? We add additional details, we pull from our knowledge of how shows are supposed to go, we make assumptions, we pull from our previous examples and understanding of it. And so we're really getting sucked into our own mental representation of it. The stimulus is providing us the data. Oatley describes this as similar to how a computer runs a program, right? So you have the code, but it doesn't become meaningful until it's, you press go and then the computer runs it, right? And so the code is kind of the stimulus, and then your brain is running the programming, it's running the simulation. Well, we can think about how people get drawn into entertainment media the same way we can think about how people get drawn to political narratives, right? People that watch the news and get really sucked into it, get really caught up in what's happening, just mentally and cognitively just drawn in where that world feels like where they currently are. Their consciousness is just kind of sucked in the same way you get into a book or movie. You can't stop thinking about it. You're watching it all the time. You're always kind of getting really deeply invested in it. So kind of just describe this with my colleague, John Velez, who used to be here, who's now in Indiana, as very simply as the experience of being in a political world, right? It's the same way we can think about consciously being in a narrative world, we can think about consciously being in a political narrative. A more technical definition would be the instantiation of mental models that represent the political world, resulting in the experience of that constructed world as a current state of being. Instantiation is kind of when you have the computer code, is that creation of a particular instance, right? So you have a mental model is the mental resources we have. And so it's drawing from those mental resources and creating a particular instance that you currently experience, as in this case, a current state of being, meaning you're there rather than kind of the world around you. Now, the reason it's good to have this separation between transportation generally in political transportation is that there are some key distinctions when we think about particularly entertainment and fictional narratives and political narratives. Now, one clear one is that we know that fictional narratives are fake, right? We know that they're just made up. And we can go into those fictional worlds, we can experience, and then we can come back and we come back to our daily lives. Now, I say this with the caveat that of course there are people who have a hard time learning this line, they get a little too sucked in. But putting that aside, right? In general, you know what's fiction, you go into it and you come back and everything's fine, right? You go about your life, even if you think about it a lot, you view that distinction. With political narratives though, this line kind of doesn't really exist in the minds of people, right? Now, in reality, political narratives are out there, right? They're mediated. They're about a world that we don't directly experience a lot of the times. That's not to say that we don't often have experiences where issues affect us or people aren't caught up in certain things. They might even be on the news, right? But for the most part, right, the political world are constructed worlds. They're narratives about things that happen that we don't actually live. And so there is a dividing line between our lives and the world we see out there, but it doesn't feel like that, right? It feels like it's one and the same, that it's all the same life world, that we're talking about the real world without paying attention to the fact that no matter whose narrative it is, there's some kind of construction involved. It's not a direct reflection of reality. It's a retelling of reality. It's a kind of presentation of reality. And again, it's out there. And so that distinction becomes important for kind of how narratives fit into people's everyday lives. With fictional, right, you know it's there and you come back. With political narratives, it permeates, right? It goes over that line and becomes part of your daily life, your daily existence. Now, another key distinction is when we think about transportation generally, it's usually thought about as occurring in particular instances. You watch a show, you get transported, you come back. With political narratives, though, it's constant, right? People are always, if you're checking the news, you're watching it, you're checking your phone, you're talking about it, you're just kind of constantly going into that world, you're thinking about it. It's kind of always pervasive for people that are really drawn in, right? And so it's kind of talking about this endless sea of political narratives where it's not just a one-off, right? We're not transported to particular instances. We're thinking about an entire existence in which you're kind of swimming in the sea of political narratives. And so that kind of led to this conceptual model that I did with John Velez and Joshua Dunn, who used to be a PhD student here. We published this in the Annals a couple of years ago, and I'll kind of introduce this and I'll come back to it. But here's kind of a representation of what this might look like, and I'll get to some of the terms in a second. But right on the top, the A level, we're thinking about how there's a multitude of narratives, right? Now, 3 is obviously an incredibly simplified version of it, but it's just to represent, we're not talking about one narrative, we're talking about a stream of narratives. And for each narrative, we mentally represent it. And that mental representation goes into our overall database knowledge about the political world. And that knowledge affects how we mentally represent it and how we experience it. And so I'll come back to this in a second, but just kind of, and then we can see the downstream effects on how we experience it and then that to our behavior. But to kind of back up a little bit and go through some specific terms, we can think about situation models and mental models. And these are applied when we're thinking about traditional processing of narratives. So can someone give me an example of a popular sitcom or TV show that you like? Golden Girls, okay. Now, I don't know how many people here have watched the Golden Girls. Okay, good enough. Can someone recall a particular episode of the Golden Girls that stands out?
There's just one of these bunch of old ladies.
Oh, maybe I have seen that one.
When they had to make a theme song about they tried to make a theme song about Miami.
Okay, the episode where they had to make a theme song about Miami, right? So a situation model is when you model a particular instance, right? And so you're mentally modeling that specific situation. In this case, we can think about an episode, right? What happened in that episode? They had to make a theme song, and I'm sure hilarity ensued and all this stuff. And so you can kind of remember that specific episode. You can think about any show in which you've done this. There's going to be some episodes that stand out, right? Well, collectively, you see multiple episodes and you pull them together. You create an overall mental representation, which is a mental model, right? We're not talking about specific instances. We're talking about a collection of instances and events and characters, and it builds and builds, right? And so now, of course, you're going to lose some details along the way. You're not going to remember every episode. You're not going to remember every situation. You'll probably forget some characters, their motivations, or certain events. But we still have to have an overall representation of it is. So when we watch a new episode, we know what's going on, right? We don't have to start from scratch. And so this provides us an overall database. Well, thinking about kind of in politics, right? An example here is we can think about the murder of George Floyd, right? A particular striking news event that caught a lot of people's attention. And so people were paying attention to it. People were learning about it. People were learning about the cop and all the background of the other cops. And then we had the aftermath and all that, right? So that's a particular situation that might be mentally modeled. And then you can think about a much broader understanding of the Black Lives Matters movement, right? Which includes this, but goes back far, years before that, includes Kaepernick, includes other instances, includes resistance to it, issues with the police, right? And so it's a much more complex mental representation, but again, necessary to understand particular instances, right? And so the backlash to George Floyd didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building, frustration had been building, attitudes about what was going on with police brutality had been building, and then you get the aftermath, right? And so we can kind of think about how this works. Well, we came up with this term of political story world models, which are basically broad, inclusive mental models about the political world. So not just even Black Lives Matters, but the overall world. When we think about, at least in American politics, when we think about politics, we're thinking about a really large scope, right? We're thinking about a lot of different things that might be involved. And so, for example, when you get these poll questions about how optimistic are you in the future of America's direction, right? And you see a large majority say the US is going the wrong direction, that they're falling behind economically, and that political polarization will continue, right? We're thinking big picture. What's going on with America? Who's involved? Now, again, you can't remember every single detail. You're not going to call into mind every single detail, but it's a very expansive database that we use. It's usually, in this case, geographically bounded. It's about the United States. Even if they're interrelational relationships, it's usually through the lens and context of American politics. When you think about the players involved, and we'll have details that will kind of come to play at different certain times. Well, this provides the overall background database you might have, and you'll have assumptions about who's good and bad, what's at stake, what's important, all of that. So when you encounter a new political narrative, you draw from your database, you draw from your wealth of knowledge to inform that model. You fill in gaps, you pull from knowledge you already know, and that informs a particular representation you have of that moment in time. And then you can get transported into it, right? If you do get transported, you don't have to, right? You could tune it out completely. But if you do, right, you are pulling from that specific issue and also your mental database. And that gives you the political transportation in which your instantiation pulls from what you already have, what you already know, your attitudes, your evaluations, your assessments, and assumptions about people. Now, the other intriguing thing about this model is that you don't need a stimulus, right? If we can have mentally model the world, the political world at all times, we can get absorbed in our thoughts at any point. And for those of you who follow politics, I'm sure you've done this plenty of times, where you can start thinking about political issues. And this particularly applies to things that you're concerned about and concerns you have, threats you perceive. You start thinking about it, you start getting worked up about it, and you get drawn into it, such that your consciousness is focused on those thoughts, on that kind of distant world. And we can think about these kind of hypothetical scenarios, these worst case scenarios people might imagine, right? You hear the term Nazi being thrown around all the time now, and people thinking about, if Trump continues, he'll run like the Nazis run with the Democrats in control. They'll be just like the Nazis. I don't know if anyone heard that MGT referred to the Gestapo, the police, the other day, right? So this is a common trope that people draw on, but it represents this picturing of the worst case scenario and imagining this dystopian future to the point that people get, feel sick about it, feel so concerned about something. And maybe it's grounded in reality, but a lot of times we exaggerate, right? We kind of overblow things. We imagine the worst case scenarios, but we get really sucked up into it, and it can be really impactful. Well, what are the consequences of this? Both, regular transportation and self-driven transportation. Well, one, it really affects attitudes because you get more persuaded when you're drawn into narratives. There's a lot of research in narrative persuasion about how people are going to be more affected and more likely to change their opinions through narratives versus just straight up information processing. And part of it is you process things differently. It's less effortful. And you also you reduce your counter arguing as you get involved in the plot and you start carrying what's happening. And then you can just internalize the values, positions, ideas that are being put out there, the character evaluations. And now if you watch, shows on MSNBC or Fox, they tell these stories, right? And they kind of give you these background information to tell you why you should be concerned. Here's who's evil, what's going on. And these can really get internalized, and these effects can linger on for a while. And part of the reason this happens is because people become so invested in plot outcomes. Right? For anyone that's watched a show like Breaking Bad or Sopranos or any of those other characters where there's some gray area protagonists who do a lot of bad things, but you still root for anyways, even though you would say morally, maybe I shouldn't be supporting this, right? I shouldn't be supporting somebody who kills other people just because they're inconvenient for him. Well, you're not valuing things on that kind of rational scale. You're valuing them based on plot outcomes, right? You're really invested in certain people winning. Well, and the same thing can be applied to political narratives where people get so invested in certain outcomes and who they want to win and what they want to happen that they kind of put logic aside. In fact, truth and facts can kind of be besides the point sometimes, right? Polana has this really good phrase that sometimes rumors are too good to be false. It means not just in politics, but in real life, a lot of times we hear some rumor about somebody and we know it's ridiculous, we know it's probably not true, but we still believe it anyways because we want it to be true. And because the moral evaluation contained in that rumor is more important than the details themselves. If it proves this person's bad, if it proves that, what they're doing, they're up to no good, we can buy into that, right? And so this perspective can kind of help us understand things like QAnon, where, they're proved wrong every step of the way, right? Nothing they predicted ever came right, but people kept going along with it. Why? Because they were so invested in the ideas and the overall storyline that the facts could be kind of cast aside. So just a quick overview of some of the stuff that I've done with colleagues that have looked at some things in terms of the effects of political transportation or related concepts. A lot of this has been in the context of candidate support. So the initial paper with John looked at how being transported in campaign narratives led to more support for the candidates. Some other work has looked at how narratives can encourage people to visualize the future more, and then they can kind of get emotionally invested in that, which can then affect candidate support. Then also some work looking at how people identify with politicians and how that can kind of draw them in. Another stream that I haven't done as much work on, but I think is more important, more in line with what I really care about, is the effect on conflict. All right, that when you get drawn into plot outcomes, when you get really sucked into the battle, really stopping the opposition becomes the most important thing. Really, that if you really think the other side is evil, then there's almost nothing that isn't justified to stop them. If they are the existential threat to the country, right, that is going to be the most consequential thing. And so they're willing to kind of endorse what needs to be done. Got a current paper that's in R&R process that kind of looks at how we get more affected or more drawn into stories about enemies. That's really what affects people. And then this other paper that I've done that shows that when people are transported into political narratives in which their party is going to lose a political battle, they suddenly perceive that they can do less about it, that there's really not much people can do to affect the political system that's out of their control. And when they have those feelings of hopelessness, they become more likely to support hostility and violence. All right, so that's kind of where I've been the last few years. Now I'm going to highlight the research that Melissa, Devin, and I have been working on in talking about news addiction. So to start, I want to kind of set the stage a little bit and help us think about what's going on in the news, right? If you've been following the news, things have been a little dire, right? So of course we had Corona, and we started off with this kind of maybe it's going to be a threat, and then building threat, and all of a sudden it's here, counting cases, counting deaths. For those who followed, it's just constant updates, constant news about coronavirus. Who's dying, all the concerns. Still a lot of uncertainty and anxiety involved because we don't know how it's going to play out. Talked about their, all the stuff that happened after George Floyd, all the clashes that were involved, a lot of conflict and a lot of issues there. Of course, we had the insurrection, which was literally a moment in time which none of us have ever seen. A direct attack on the nation's capital, quite concerning. A lot of wildfires going on across the U.S. A lot of concern there. I'm from California. It's pretty scary for me to kind of see how much of the country, the state's being burned down, but it's spreading to other states as well. So if you've been following these stories, you've probably kind of maybe felt like, man, could the world get any worse? Could it be any scarier? Huh?
Don't conjure it up, man. Don't say it.
The murder hornets didn't come from.
Well, you stole my the answer is yes. Things can always get worse. There can always be murder hornets. Now, the point is if you follow the news, there's almost no end to scary things you can find. And it's obviously gotten worse the last few years. So what might this look like, right? How does this happen? What does this look like for people who are maybe addicted to the news? So you start off by getting drawn into news stories, right? And you get really absorbed in them. They can really affect you. They're really emotionally powerful, and you can't stop thinking about them, right? You're staying up at night, thinking about it, kind of all these things. Well, what do you do to help, right? Most people think, maybe I should check the news, right? Maybe I'll find something good. Maybe I'll find something that might be a glimmer of hope and all this stuff. It's kind of this misguided hope that you're going to find something better, and you don't. You find murder hornets, right? And then it becomes compulsive, right? That you can't stop doing it. It's happening all the time, and this might lead to kind of problems where you're having a harder time focusing on other things. Maybe you're checking your phone instead of paying attention to your family or work or whatever you might be doing. Maybe you're losing sleep. So that's kind of can help us think about how problematic this relationship with the news can be. Now, we think about news viewing as a good thing, right? We're supposed to stay informed. We're supposed to know what's going on with our country, and certainly it's good to have details, but it can lead to bad effects for people who have a kind of maladaptive relationship with it. It's not really kind of positive interaction. Now, it's important to kind of point out that this is distinct from just watching the news a lot, right? The typical idea of a news junkie is somebody who consumes a lot of news. Now, you might have somebody who watches the news constantly, stays informed, knows a lot what's going on, but doesn't really have the same kind of emotional connection, doesn't have that same kind of distress, and doesn't really kind of travel with them day to day when they're kind of done. They might just have CNN all the time. Right? So we did collected some data. First, we conceptualized what this might look like. We drew from previous literature and media addictions, problematic media use, other forms of addiction, and kind of looked at some of the classic criteria you might have there. And so for some people, they talk about 7 criteria that are typical for media addictions, which are salience, mood regulation, relapse, withdrawal, tolerance, conflict. Well, we'll go with that for now. Right. We mostly worked off of this, but we made some adjustments based on what we thought made sense for news. One, we thought that transportation was important to have in there because it's that process of getting drawn in that really is central to it. Preoccupation is equivalent basically to salience, which is you're always thinking about it, right? It's always on the mind. You're ruminating about issues. It's just kind of constantly there. Misregulation is just kind of a different way of us talking about mood management. It's this idea that you think that checking the news is going to help you, right? That if you check the news, that you're maybe going to feel a little bit better, right? But it's misregulation because that's wrong, right? You're not going to feel better. Most people don't. If they have some issue, if they have some anxiety based on the news, checking the news isn't going to be the source of the solution. Underregulation, we thought was better than relapse because relapse is really specific. But really what we're thinking about is the inability to control it, compulsive behavior, the need to do it all the time, and knowing that you should be doing it so much, but not being able to help yourself. Interference we have is just a version of conflict. We're thinking about how it disrupts the other parts of your lives, such as time with family, attention to work or school, and difficulty sleeping. We didn't include tolerance or withdrawal because those really make more sense for kind of psychotropic substances like drugs, where you have a physical reaction, right? Tolerance to a drug where you need more and more to get the same high is a little bit different than needing more and more news to get the same outcome. That doesn't mean, and that also is kind of covered by the compulsive aspect of it. And then also withdrawal, you're not going to have the same type of physiological response without it. So we collected some data from a large national sample. and performed a confirmatory factor analysis and found that the items we had all loaded appropriately to the dimensions that we kind of outlined here. And also that these dimensions loaded onto one global factor, some overall umbrella concept of news addiction. So that this all kind of worked out the way we were hoping it would. And then we performed a latent class analysis, and I should say by we, I mean Melissa and Devin. They'd often have statistical conversations that I would just have to kind of nod and pretend I knew what they were talking about. But this is looking at kind of, you look at the data and you pull everybody together and see who clusters around certain types of responses, right? And so these are looking at these 5 dimensions of news addiction. What do kind of groups of people look like and how they might respond? So at the high end, we have people who are very high at risk for news addiction, that they're displaying all the characteristics we might see, right? So across the board on a 7-point scale, they're all scoring above 6, right? The next level is kind of moderate, right? They're kind of in the 4.5 range. Some absorption, some transportation, some negative outcomes, but nothing too severe, but kind of definitely presence across the board. But the things in the next group is really interesting because you have that initial part where you have kind of transportation preoccupation, but the more problematic consequences of it, it falls off, right? So they're getting into the news a little bit, not super deep, but they're kind of getting absorbed, thinking about it, but they're not having those same kind of outcomes that people in the other groups are. And there might be some reasons for that. We'll talk about one potential moderator in a minute. And finally, the people who just, not in it at all. So what are some of the consequences of news addiction? Well, we've thought about a few, right? And we're going to present some preliminary data we have now that's pointing to some real kind of likelihood of relationship here. But first, I'm going to talk about kind of health, right? We can think about different effects on ill-being or kind of negative states. Now, most media addiction literature shows that media addiction is not good for you, right? You're going to end up having some negative consequences, whether it's smartphones or Facebook or internet or gaming, whatever it might be, right? That if you're kind of plugged into a device or something electronic for too long, it's usually not good, right? So there's that, right? We kind of expect that just from that overall pattern. But beyond that, right, as we've discussed, the news is often focused on terrible things, right? It's all about these negative issues, these threatening events, right? You're all probably familiar with the term, if it bleeds, it leads, right? The news wants to tell you things that are terrible because you'll keep checking to see if they're still terrible, and yes, they are. So if you're constantly involved and constantly absorbed in it, you're constantly thinking about stressful things. And so we kind of like to describe this as being kind of stuck in this world, right? It's this dangerous, scary world that you can't get out of. And it's kind of like quicksand. The more you try to get out, the deeper you sink in, unless you unplug completely. Well, we know that being stressed is not good for you, right? Stress is really a bad thing in terms of outcomes. So research shows that when you're constantly stressed about something, it has important implications for things like chronic anxiety and stress. And I say this is so you can be really stressed about something and it can extend beyond that, right? So you can be stressed about a particular thing, and if it stays on your mind, you might think about that, but it also becomes generalized, right? If you become overly stressed about something, then you just overall start developing stress and anxiety that you don't necessarily know where it's coming from, just because it's kind of permeating you, right? And so we would kind of expect that people that are constantly stressed about the news should experience generalized stress and anxiety. But beyond that, we actually think there has some implications for physical health too, because we know that stress relates to inflammation. Inflammation is not good, right? And inflammation has been shown to relate to all sorts of negative physical repercussions. So when we perceive a threat, when we perceive something stressful, physiologically, it activates processes that increase inflammation, which are fine in the short term, right? If you have to escape from a tiger, it's good to have those shoot up so you can run away and be fine. But if you can't turn it off, right? If you keep that stress going on 24/7, then the inflammation never goes away. And that can lead to things like that are kind of physical ailments, back pain, neck pain, GI issues, migraines, all sorts of things. Anything you can kind of think of in terms of physical tension, you might see that. And in the long haul, you can think about serious disease that might result as well. So we looked at how these different classes of news addiction related to mental and physical health, and we found pretty striking results. And this is controlling for demographics, personality traits. Neuroticism was the strongest predictor here, But right after that, news addiction was second in terms of being related, the strength of relationship with these outcomes. And we also controlled for overall news use, right? So this is suggesting that it's not just watching the news, there's something about the relationship with how people watch the news that leads to these outcomes. And so on the right here on both sides, we have high levels of news addiction. You can see how much higher it is in terms of mental and physical well-being, ill-being than the other classes. And then if you have the moderate levels, right, you're more likely to have mental ill-being than low or minimal. And there's some evidence here for physical, but nothing compares to that distinction with the high level, right? So some clear indication. I guess this data is correlational, right? So we can only infer so much, but we know there's some relationship there. We know there's some kind of connection there. And then the other thing we looked at, kind of looking at the data in a little different ways, was hostility. Are you kind of willing to support hostile methods or kind of actions against the opposing group? Do you kind of hold them in contempt? Things of that nature. Well, the news focuses on a lot of things, but also focuses on partisan conflict a lot, right? And when partisans see partisan conflict, it makes their identity salient. It means they think about themselves as partisans. When people think about themselves as partisans, they're more likely to be hostile towards the other group. Just as a basic process, right? This is just something that we've seen throughout human history. But it becomes even worse when you perceive a threat, right? When you see that there's something threatening going on, that the other group is coming for you, you have a reason to be concerned, you're more likely to be aggressive, you're more likely to feel like you have to do something about it. Well, for news addicts, they're again stuck in this world where there's just constant threats, right? No matter who's in the White House, no matter what election you won, as soon as you turn around, there's a new fight to be had, right? It's just kind of constant, endless stress and battling. No party can ever feel safe. Everybody's always going at it, and the news is always constantly reporting on it. So we would kind of expect to see this chronic salience and chronic perception of threat, which would then lead to support for hostility. Here's some results here. I apologize for those who don't know how to read regression, but this is looking at all these different factors that might predict hostility. And at the bottom here, we have our results looking at news addiction. So what we have is basically these are standardized coefficients, so we can compare them. The higher the number, relatively, the more likely it is to predict hostility. And we can see news addiction at 0.47 is clearly the strongest predictor here. This includes the need for conflict, which means people who are prone to light fights. I like being argumentative. I like getting contention with other people. Even for those people, even when controlling from that, even when controlling from news use, even controlling from personality, we're still seeing a very dramatic effect in news addiction. And the R-squared numbers tells us how much of the variance in the outcomes are explained. And so adding news addiction adds 7.4%, giving us a total of 71%, which is a really large number for politics. So pretty, I'd like to say exciting. Obviously don't want to be excited about things being, bad in terms of conflict, but in terms of, what's going on with the results, it's really an indication that something's happening here. But again, correlational data, so you can only assume so much in terms of what the relationship looks like. Now, to end on a more positive note, not everybody's hostile, right? Just because you're a partisan, just because you're addicted, doesn't mean you have to want to smash your opponent's face in, right? You might be more willing to kind of have a reasonable discussion or kind of keep things tempered. So one of the things we thought about that might be helpful here is mindfulness. Mindfulness is a very trendy thing these days, but there's good reason, right? There's a lot of research suggests that mindfulness is helpful. Now, mindfulness just kind of broadly as a disposition can be thought about non-judgmental awareness. So in this case, you know what you're feeling, you know what's going on, you know what you're thinking, you know what's happening, you're paying attention to things, and you're not too invested in it. You're not making judgments, you're just kind of seeing, you're observing it. And people that learn to do this are capable of saying, okay, I'm acting a little angry here, and they can disassociate a little bit. And research has shown that when people are kind of aware of their negative thought patterns, they kind of see what they're doing, they're able to kind of reduce the impact of that. And so there's a wealth of research here that's kind of shown that mindfulness can reduce intergroup conflict, implicit bias, all the types of things that we'd be concerned about. So when we added it in as a moderator, we did find that it moderated the relationship between news addiction and hostility. And here we have the black bar on the top is low mindfulness, and the dots are the high mindfulness. So moving from lower to higher levels of news addiction. As we get higher on the news addiction scale, those who are low in mindfulness, hostility shoots up. No, relationships still exist for high mindfulness, but it's attenuated, right? It's less dramatic. So you see there's a big difference on the end in terms of how hostile they are. So, use addiction is still going to lead to hostility, but mindfulness, people who are more generally mindful might have that little bit reduced. All right, so just finish on some kind of possible next steps that we're working on. Joshua's actually working on this with some of this stuff too. One, we just applied for a BA grant. We'll see how that works out, to look at the antecedents of news addiction, basically looking at what might predict who is a news addict. So we've included personality, but we want to go beyond that, looking at kind of gratification sought in terms of why people turn to media, psychological needs such as need for cognition, things of that nature, media diet, the types of media people consume. Anything I'm missing?
Factors that
Right. Yeah. So overall, kind of things that might be related to general addictions. We also thought it would be good to look at kind of develop a more in-depth understanding of kind of the cause and consequences of experience of news addiction. Some kind of qualitative work to really get inside the box understanding what this looks like, why people might become addicted, or what the consequences might be, or how that looks like through interviews or media diaries. And also to kind of examine the mechanisms through which mindfulness might attenuate this. Right? We have a few items about mindfulness. We don't know. It's possible that mindfulness reduces news addiction to begin with. It's possible that it reduces the effect from news addiction to negative outcomes, or both. Right? And then so maybe understanding what type of mindfulness and also where it helps most would be helpful. And then also thinking about how it might relate to different forms of civic engagement. Right? So I mentioned that we tend to think about watching the news as being good. Well, we don't want people just to tune out, right? An easy way to stop being an addict is just never do it, right? And if you stop completely, go, just cold turkey, well, you don't have the negative outcomes. But in this case, it's not like drugs where you're better off just not doing it. We want people to be informed, right? If there's important information, if it's related to health or if things going on in the world, it's good for people to know. So how do we kind of think about what civic engagement might look like? It's possible that news addiction leads to bad, kind of antisocial forms of civic engagement. Are there ways to think about to promote better forms of pro-social civic engagement? So questions along those natures. All right, that's all I got. So I don't know.
That's cool. No, we've got some time for some questions then. So anything you guys would like to ask?
Also watch the chat in case any of you guys have questions.
I
Yes.
just want to point out too that Bryan won the Chancellor's Research Award.
Oh, absolutely.
Ashley's also won it, so.
Well, he won it this year. So that's two from out of row, not the second.
And 3 in a row, I think.
Yeah.
Eric, so again,
We're on a roll.
doing some great research.
So I really like your idea about news addiction. I think that's a cool area for research. I'm curious, since we have to stay in the news to be civically engaged, do you have any ideas for researching like empowering individuals to use news in a healthy way, or like interventions to help them develop mindfulness?
Well, so that's actually one of the things we're working on. Melissa and I actually had a meeting just earlier that we were working with Devin, and then Joshua was involved in, Michael Sarah from psychology, looking at potential interventions, right? And mindfulness is one of the things that we think that could potentially help, because if you're aware of what's happening, if you can pay attention to it, then you can kind of have a better relationship with it. So, we still have to do research on it, but hopefully like the idea is that you could still watch the news, but you could be more aware of when you're kind of getting down that slippery slope, or if it's kind of creating negative reactions, and then maybe you can cut it down a little bit and kind of do it in a healthier manner without having to stop completely, is the one idea that we have. There are probably others, but that's kind of the main thread we're looking at right now.
So we do have one question from the chat. This is from Bruce. Bruce wanted to know, what was the most difficult concept to define in your research? And then how did you overcome that?
That's a good question. I think we spent a lot of time with, I think the transportation and preoccupation were pretty easy. Interference. I think misregulation and underregulation were the ones that we went back and forth with the most, because they are conceptually similar, but also distinct in some other things we looked at. But that's really, I think, where you're getting at the heart of kind of how are people, what does that look like, and how is it different from just news consumption in general? And so I think this idea of misregulation that people think is going to help. And so our questions asked specifically kind of like, checking the news will make me feel better, right? And so we're kind of tapping into this idea that the motivation behind it, the things you expect. But it took us a while to go back there. Melissa and I had a lot of conversations about what that kind of process looked like. And we were kind of moving in and out of different bodies of literature, but I think kind of defining that middle area was kind of part of the hardest. Yeah, sure.
Great research, very interesting. Two questions. First of all, have you measured the valence of the news that people are reading? Are they always related to negative news, or they may be also related to positive news, and then we confirm the impact of the news?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we're curious about, right? The problem is it's a little hard to kind of like measure that probably because it might involve some kind of content analysis. I mean, we can look at media diet, the sources they use, and there's certainly some sources that are going to be more sensational than others. Certainly, we would expect if people are using more positive forms of news versus more sensational and negative ones, that the effects won't be so bad, right? We're making assumptions in this data at least. And I think we're justified in saying that the news is usually stressful, negative, threatening information. Of course, there's going to be some variation, and that's one of the things we've talked about, but kind of pinning down how we directly measure that's a little challenging.
Second question is, I wonder if you ever have the relationship between news addiction and exposure to misinformation or misperception.
We haven't. I mean, we've maybe talked about that a little bit. I mean, this is we've done the one survey, and so that's all we've done. Like, probably a lot of what happens these days is on Facebook, right? And then people that get really sucked into the stories they're going to Facebook, and they get down these kind of rabbit holes of misinformations and stories, and they're reading all these other stories and kind of goes down this negative link, and probably that's making things worse, right? And also, if it's misinformed, that all the more concerning. So yeah, I think there's some interesting avenues there, but not anything that we've gotten into at this point. Yeah.
So my question actually is very similar with that are kind of related to the news content and looking at the creators of the content, right? So, and obviously, a lot of times they have to write the story the way their editors want, and there's sort of this public expectation. But I mean, is there any room in this to say, like, do the journalists themselves, the news creators, are they feeling like trapped in this cycle of they're trying to do it to get people to get to that interference level, where they're kind of doing it, or is there reservation? It kind of seems like looking at the creator of the problem would be, I don't know, probably way too big at this, but just to.
Yeah, we have actually talked about that. We haven't gone anywhere in terms of research goes, but because like the ideal, the idea of like journalists is that they're supposed to, have this civic duty, right? Where they're helping us to society, they're informing us, providing good information. But of course, economic pressures and all that encourage that it bleeds, if it bleeds, it leads, right?
Yeah.
And then if you have partisan sources, all the more to skew it, and all things of that nature. We kind of talked about how like, this might be something in terms of implications for journalistic norms, because norms emphasize sensationalism and conflict and drama and all of those things that would cause the problems that we're talking about. How do you actually go about getting journalists to change their norms? And we can say, here's another problem, but certainly probably a lot of them are aware that there's issues with how the news is presented. So yeah, it's a problem I don't know in terms of.
Because it's like, the big pharmaceutical companies are finally being held accountable for addiction issues, and they're like having to come to terms with it. It almost seems like this line of research could then be used at some point to hold the news companies accountable. If it look, you're like perpetuating a cycle of violence and addiction. So it's just an interesting possible application and
Yeah,
but
I don't think we had planned on taking down the newspapers just quite yet, but I think hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah.
Melissa.
We have had discussions about, in addition to mindfulness interventions to mitigate effects, also possibly thinking about news literacy
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's one of the things, like when you're really stuck into these worlds and so like, for example, with COVID, right? What they like, early on, especially, you would see these cases of, 35 healthy individual dies of COVID. And like, it's this one case, seems like they make it seem like it's, very common. Like if you're healthy and normal, like you're in danger, but for most people, like that's not going to be the outcome. People that don't understand that the news is doing that as a way to get people sucked in are going to have negative repercussions. So making people more aware of that could be one potential venue of help. Yeah.
So we have time for, I think, one more question.
I think.
So my question is very similar to Jesse's. So you already answered it, but also thinking about like just the opportunity in like the College of Media and Communication, working with future journalists, like not necessarily like what to change, but I think just starting with like this awareness and this is going on.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that would be a great venue. I think that's currently outside of our scope of expertise, but I think it's definitely like an interesting approach. Yeah. Was there short one? Was there one more?
I have a
Short question.
Yeah, just clarity. You said something about the difference between narrative transportation and political transportation. That no particular stimulus is needed, or what will the news or like over time exposure to news be like the stimuli?
Yeah. So, well, a couple of quick responses. One, in terms of entertainment narratives, you can actually have the same process where you don't need this particular stimulus. If you're like really into a show, you probably think about it a lot, and you probably ruminate and think about episodes and kind of get drawn back in. So it's highlighting a process that could happen. But with politics, yeah, to your point, like it is stimulus over time, right? It starts with the stimulus. You have to have the stimulus to have that database. Now, this could be news, it could be interpersonal communication, it could be what you read on Facebook. So there's a lot of different stimuli that would kind of factor in. And so with politics, it's a much more dispersed set of stimuli, but that's where the information comes from, right? People don't know about the news without mediated communication. So that the database has to start with a stimulus. It's just that kind of direct relationship with it is maybe not as pronounced as with entertainment.
All right. Well, once again, thank me. That's right. Join me in thanking Dr. McLaughlin.